subconscious.
Yeah, that's the level of expertise that an experienced trader has.
Mm-hmm.
There is one more thing, though. I mean, Al doesn't talk about it, but I've noticed it in his work, and that was one of the guiding principles for my development. And that is, so let me give you an example. As a network engineer and architect, I was able, still am, able to see the network that I'm designing in my head, even before it is documented. Like I can create the data center in my head and walk through the aisles and touch the devices and know where the cables go, all right? With 100% clarity. There's no shred of doubt that this device goes into rack unit number 32 and, a blue cable is connected to that port, things like that. I do carpentry. I used to do carpentry as a hobby. And when I'm building something, I can imagine it before I start building it. As a software programmer, when I code today for trading, I don't draw a flowchart. The flowchart is in my head. I just sit at the computer, pour a mug of coffee, and start coding. And it is usually correct within the first or second tries. So I don't make logical mistakes. I don't make syntax mistakes. It's like typing a letter to a friend. That comes from having strong imagination about what you do. And in price action trading, when I started out, I was comparing it to other skills that I had developed. I was like, oh man, I'm not there because I have no imagination about the price action, about the chart. And I was watching Al and seeing that he says, oh, we had such and such a bar or that setup last week on that day. And he would scroll the chart back to that day and there it was. And for me, it was like, this is like superpowers, man. How can he do it? And then I realized that, okay, so the gap between where I am and where he is because he has an imagination about the chart and I don't. So how could I get an imagination about the chart? Well, there are two ways. One is you can practice and hope that you get it. The second one is to think in a structured way and develop that structured thinking more and more and more until you get it. Think about how you read a book. Do you read the book letter by letter or word by word? Probably not. You read it phrase by phrase. Like every time you look at a sentence, like a line in the book, your eyes goes bam, 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 and that sentence is read. And then you go to the second sentence and it is like bam, bam, bam. If you track the eye movement of a person who is reading a book, it doesn't stop. It like glance, 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 next line. Glance, 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 next line. How can they do that? Because sentences are made of phrases or groups of words that are tied together with more energy and strength. Those are the pauses in conversation. Those are, you have an utterance and then there's a pause and then you have another utterance. Those are sentence structures. Sentences are made of those phrases that have stronger bonds of energy together. Okay. Now, I happen to know this because I've studied linguistics in my master's course. But the same thing goes about the charts. Price structures that build a chart are like phrases in a sentence. They have energy connections that are stronger in some areas and weaker in other areas. The way an experienced trader remembers the chart is not because of remembering that single bar. They remember the chart just like phrases in a sentence, like this structure happened that led to that structure and that led to this other structure. And those transition points are usually a few options, just as I talked about today. Like you have about 3 sometimes 4, but usually 3 conditions for every event in the market as a response. And that's the way a price action trader remembers the chart. They remember it as bursts of energy that are connected in a certain way together. And that gives them the ability to have imagination about the chart. So they remember what happened 2 weeks ago, which seems a completely impossible task. How could you remember? So 2 weeks is what? Let's see. 2 weeks is, so we have 81 bars in a day times 10. That's 800 bars. How could you possibly remember what happened within 800 bars? Well, that's because of those structures. Then there is a second layer, and this is the human aspect of it. Every trader at a certain level of proficiency starts to attach emotions to his work. Okay? And the energy of the market triggers those emotions. You start to remember them. Like, I was so disappointed Tuesday last week. And I remember what happened because of the energy association with the price action of Tuesday last week. So my point is that one of the very good gauges to measure your skill level is, do you remember what happened? How long ago do you remember what happened? And this goes from a higher time frame to a lower time frame. Like for example, the period that I have traded, I remember most of it on the daily chart. And I know exactly what happened. You know, that bar went below the low of that bar. That's what happened. This was the entire price structure of the year. These are the important events. You start to remember them. But you remember them because you have created a structure in your head that is not dependent on any single bar. It's dependent on those bonds of energy between patterns and the emotions that you have attached to them. That's one of the markers that when you assess somebody, when you talk to them about their skill, you look for these markers. And the level that they can speak to that addresses those points shows the skill level that they have achieved. And you can measure it on yourself too, based on that criteria.
Ali, I was just going to say, I don't remember where I read it, but I think it was in a book called Peak by Anders Ericsson. And it was a similar situation with chess players where they judge the skill level of different levels of chess masters. And the best chess players can tell you exactly where every piece is on a chessboard just by looking at it for 30 seconds.
Yes.
But when they tested their memory for other basic tasks, their memory wasn't any better than anyone else's because they understood the patterns and the structure of the chess pieces. And when they saw something on the board, what they saw in front of them had meaning. It was a strategy. It wasn't just each individual piece separately memorized. It was, oh, this is this type of open, or this is an aggressive stance, a defensive stance. So it's similar to what you're saying about the bars. Is like when you look at a bar, or when Al looks at a bar, you're seeing it in a context of a strategy and a structure and an entire sentence or an entire paragraph. Whereas I think the less experienced you are, you see just the bar in isolation and not what it means as a whole. So I think that the comparison you made in price action trading is similar to that example in chess, is that the better you get, the more mental models you have for the structure you're seeing in front of you.
Yeah, and you see it instantly. There is no thinking.
Right.
As soon as you see it, you know, because the emotional part is already formed associations with those things. And all of us are dependent on our, the exact psychological terminology for it is COEX, condensed experience. And that is not formed in your head, it's formed in your entire body. All right. So a good trader has formed a lot of these COEXs for every different price structure, or, it can be indicator pattern, doesn't matter. I have formed them for my own indicators. and I can trade them without even thinking about them. But knowing that this is how you can develop proficiency will help you to work towards developing it faster and easier. Because now you have a gauge, you can watch yourself, say, okay, so what kind of a feeling do I get? Do I have imagination about a long period of time ago? Can I close my eyes and imagine what's going to happen tomorrow with vivid detail? Like, this is going to be the opening range. This is how the bars are going to look like. That kind of stuff. As long as you don't have imagination or strong imagination about the style of trading that you're doing, in this case, price action, you're still not there. So that might be disappointing, but it's also something to work towards.
I saw mentioned the chess, and I've in Gary Kasparov's book, How Chess Imitates Life. He was the first person I had been thinking about that kind of dichotomy that you said with the three probabilistic outcomes for any scenario, and then I had been thinking it in terms of strategy and tactics. So strategy is appropriate for each of those three probabilistic outcomes, and the tactics are how you would take advantage of the probability.
Yep.
And then he used those same terms in his book, and it just like shook me. And so I've reread that book 10 times, and it's always amazing how internalized and subconscious all of those probabilistic outcomes become at a glance of the board.
Exactly, and this is the same.
Okay,
yeah, you're right. Yeah, so but look at what people do. They don't pay attention to any of this stuff, and there is just an overwhelming focus on the setups and little things that I don't say that they don't matter, but they don't matter all that much. These other things are more important. Like, how do you develop the skill? How do you make sure it is there? How do you gauge the level of proficiency you have achieved? It's not only reflected in your P&L, but your personal emotional reaction to your work is, I think, a better gauge of your proficiency level.